Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 13, the Muscular System. So, on the previous chapter, we talked about the skeletal system and how the job of the skeletal system was to store calcium deposits, to protect certain organs of the body, and to really give the body some sort of form. Now, the skeletal system by itself cannot actually move the organism. So that is the specific job of the muscular system. The muscular system, one of its functions is the movement of the entire organism. There's also the function of movement of materials within the organism, so that is blood and food. Those smooth muscles help to move that blood and food, and obviously the muscular system is made up of muscles. Now, there are three different types of muscles that can make up the muscular system, which we talked about a bit in Chapter 4. Those would be your smooth muscles, cardiac, and skeletal muscles. The types of cells, when we start to talk about the muscular system, we call those fibers. So wherever you see the term muscle fiber, I want your brain to automatically think about it being a muscle cell. So just like any other cell, there are going to be specialized structures within that cell to help that fiber, in this case, do its job. So let's start with smooth muscles first. So smooth muscle fibers are really more cylindrical shaped and they have kind of pointy ends at the end of them. They only have one nucleus in it, and it's kind of a disc-shaped nucleus, and they make these parallel lines. There are no striations in smooth muscles, as we talked about in Chapter 4, and the places that you'll find them are in the walls of hollow organs, such as your esophagus, your digestive system, your stomach, your large intestine, your small intestine, any of these places, your blood vessels that are kind of hollow. And so the contraction of smooth muscles is much slower than we would find for any of the other muscle types we're going to talk about today. And that allows it to have slower, more rhythmic types of contractions. So here we have a beautiful picture of some smooth muscle. And notice it has that flat-shaped nucleus in there, and they're kind of tapered at the ends. So that's what we mean by spindle-shaped. So smooth muscle contraction is what we consider under involuntary control, which means you don't have to actively think about getting your blood vessels to contract when they get too cold or getting them to expand when they get too warm. So it does it with a part of your brain that you don't have to think about doing it consciously. So although smooth muscle is much slower to contract than all the other types we talked about, it can sustain prolonged contractions much longer and does not fatigue nearly as easily. Another place that you'll find smooth muscles where you'll have to have these sustained contractions for an extended period of time is in your uterus if you're fortunate enough to have one. And because of those contractions that can be sustained without fatiguing very easily, that allows for childbirth to go on as it does. Second type of muscle is cardiac muscle. Only place you'll find cardiac muscle are in the walls of your heart. The fibers that make up cardiac muscle are striated like skeletal muscle, but unlike smooth muscle, and they're more tubular shaped. And they only have one nucleus as well. So instead of being kind of tapered at the ends like we saw for smooth muscle, cardiac muscle fibers have more of a branching sort of appearance to them. And they have these bridges or these points where they connect with other heart muscle cells for the intercalated disc. So the intercalated discs are the way that the muscle fibers in the heart, the cardiac muscle fibers, can communicate with one another. And they do so through these gap junctions that allow for the contractions to spread through the wall of the heart. So things that would go through there would be neurotransmitters, sodium ions, potassium ions, any of these things that will, these chemical messengers that allow to the heart to beat in a nice fashion where it's atrial ventricles or top bottom. So that allows for a nice coordinated heartbeat. And here we have pictures of some cardiac muscle. You can see these little hash marks or tick marks in their intercalated disc. And you can also see these finer lines. These finer lines here are the striations that we have there as well. And like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle is totally involuntary, which means there's a part of your brain that contracts or allows for this contraction to take place without you consciously having to think about it. And I mean, like, whew, one less thing you have to worry about. You don't have to imagine how straining and stressful it would be if you had to keep reminding your heart to beat, to beat, to beat. So it does its thing all on its own. Really cool, interesting fact about your heart muscle is that it's the hardest working muscle in your body. From the day that you are born, even before you're born, once that sucker starts beating and contracting, it does not stop until the day you die. So it is never getting a chance to rest. And we'll talk about in chapters 5 and 6 exactly what mechanisms your heart has in order to keep it from fatiguing. So relaxes completely between contractions, which helps to prevent fatigue. And the contractions, as we said before, are rhythmic, and it occurs without nervous stimulation. It can do so because it has a pacemaker, that's sinoatrial node. We'll talk about that in chapters 5 and 6. And as I said before, it is also involuntary. So the meat and potatoes of this chapter is going to be about skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle are the most widespread muscles in your body. And when you think about muscles, you're probably really thinking about the skeletal system and skeletal muscles as opposed to thinking about smooth muscles or cardiac muscles, which are both equally important. The fibers or the cells that make up skeletal muscle, they're also tubular, like we saw for the cardiac muscles, but this time they are multinucleated, which means there are multiple nuclei that are found within each skeletal muscle fiber. They're also striated, which is a feature that they share with cardiac muscles. They're really long, and a lot of times they can even run the length of the muscle. Of the 3 different muscle types that we've talked about today, skeletal muscle is the only one that's under your voluntary control, which means you consciously say arm raise, leg move, fist punch, whatever it is that you want your body to do. So here we have this nice cool picture of this skeletal muscle. Notice how there is no branching, nice straight lines, beautiful striations that we have there, and multiple nuclei that are found on each fiber. So some of the jobs of skeletal muscle in particular, because that's primarily what we're going to be talking about in this chapter, is that their big job is to allow for support. The muscles contract to oppose gravity, and that allows us to remain upright. Remember, without the skeletal muscle, the skeletal system wouldn't be able to move or go anywhere. So that's another job of the skeletal muscles, that their job is to move the bones. And the way that they're able to do that is that they have this really awesome connective tissue that forms at the very ends of each of these muscle groups, called tendons. And the tendons contract to the bones, and that allows for the bones to move. Muscles also have the important job of maintenance of a constant body temperature. Contraction causes ATP, or that cellular energy, to break down, and that breakdown of ADP to ADP releases a tremendous amount of energy, and it also releases a tremendous amount of heat, and that heat is then distributed throughout the body. So it helps to maintain that 98.6-degree body temperature. Now, skeletal muscles aren't the only organ system or the only structures that help to do this in your body, but that is one of their jobs, is to be a contributing factor in that process. Other jobs of skeletal movements, muscles, it helps to move fluids in the cardiovascular and lymphatic system, protects internal organs, and stabilizes joints. If you think about your abdominal region, there aren't a whole lot of bones in your abdominal region, are there? Of course not. So in order to protect the stomach, your small intestine, your large intestines, your pancreas, your gallbladder, all this really cool stuff that is in your abdominal region, you have abdominal muscles. So it also does provide some protection. So when we talk about skeletal muscles, interesting fact about them is that a lot of times they will work in pairs. Skeletal muscles, the way that they are attached to the muscle is that all skeletal muscles, for the most part, have an origin. That origin is where the muscle attaches to the site of a bone that is not moving. So that is what we call the origin. When you take anatomy and physiology, you'll have to learn the origins, insertions, and actions, or what we call the OIAs, of all of the muscles in the body. Right now, we're going to talk about what an origin and insertion is, what that means. So the origin of a muscle is just where that muscle attaches to a bone in the body that it does not move. So that's not the bone that's getting moved by the muscle. The insertion, on the other hand, is attached to the bone that's going to actually be moved. So when the muscle contracts, it will actually pull the tendons on the insertion part of the bone. So the tendons will actually bind and fuse with the periosteum that's surrounding the bone that it's attached to, and that allows the bone to move. So for example, the biceps brachii, when it contracts, so think about your bicep muscles, when they contract, what happens? Your forearm raises there. So you can already kind of have an idea of where the origin would be on your humerus muscle, and where the insertion should be by what bone is actually moving. And the bones of your ulna and your radius are the bones that are moving there. So how we name muscles is pretty varied, and you're going to see some really outrageous names for different types of muscles when you start to look at them. And you might be asking yourself, like, why in the world is it named that way? So it's helpful to figure out why it is that we name muscles the ways that we name them. So there are a couple of ways that we can do that. We can name them by size, shape, location, even the direction that the muscle fibers are going. You can name them by attachment, number of attachments, and even action. So there's a lot of different ways that we can name them. So obviously, if we're talking about using size as a characteristic, then maximus would be large, minimus would be smaller. Other terms can indicate size, like vastus, the vastus rectus. It's a large muscle of your quads, so one of the big muscles in your quads. Longest would be long muscles, brevis are short. They can be named by shape, deltoid, like the Greek letter delta, which is triangular shape. Trapezes is shaped like a trapezoid. Latissimus, which means wide. Tres means round. So there are other shapes that you might not necessarily be familiar with, but they're usually named after Greek and Latin terms. Location, external obliques are on the outside, whereas internal obliques are more deeper muscles. Frontalis muscle is over the front bone. We can use other terms to indicate location, so pectoralis, be chest, gluteus, buttocks, brachii, arm, sub underneath it. So if you're talking about the subscapularis, then that would be underneath the scapula. They can also be the direction of the thymus, the muscles, so abdominis rectus or vastus rectus, which means straight. Orbicularis, oculi, circular muscles around the eye. Orbiculus means kind of circular. Oculi is sort of eye. Other terms to indicate direction, transverse means across, oblique means diagonal. So you can kind of see how these muscles are named and why we named them that way. And if you have an understanding of why a muscle is named the way it is, you'll have a really great understanding of what the action, the origin, and insertion of that muscle is and where that muscle can be found in the body. So once again, more ways of naming it. Remember, we had attachment. So the sternoclenoid mastoid is attached to the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process. Brachioradialis is attached to the brachium and the radius. Number of attachments, biceps brachii has 2 points of attachment. Quadriceps femoris has 4 origins on there, and even by action, extensor digitorum extends the fingers, the adductor longus muscle abducts the thigh, adducts the thigh, which means it brings it back into the center line. And we can even talk about flexors that bend and masters that chew and levators that are muscles that lift. So here is just a really cool picture that's also found in your book of several muscles, not all the muscles, but a lot of the major superficial muscles that we find in the body. Keep in mind that this is just one level, because if we were to peel this one level back, you'd find deeper muscles in this. So that's what I mean by superficial and deep. When I say superficial, and specifically in biological classes such as human biology and A&P and so forth, when we say superficial, we mean closer to the surface of the skin or at the surface of the skin. When we say deep, we mean below that. So these superficial muscles, the muscles that you can see quite easily, most of these are superficial muscles. You do have a couple of deep muscles that we can see in here, but primarily they are the major muscles on top. So now that we have looked at the different ways that we can name muscles, and we've looked at the different muscle types that are found in the body and talked about the functions of the skeletal muscle, let's get a little bit closer to a muscle organ and see what makes up a muscle fiber. So what is it inside a muscle cell that makes it tick and do its thing? So all of these things listed here are really super important aspects of the muscle fiber that allow for it to contract the way that it does. So first we have the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma is just a really fancy name for the plasma membrane of a muscle fiber. The sarcoplasma is just a fancy name for the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber. Sarco comes from a Greek or a Latin term, which means flesh. And if you think about the first anatomists and physiologists, when they cut open the cadaver, they probably noticed the fleshy nature of the muscle. So that's why we have these sarco portions on it as opposed to plasma membrane or cytoplasm. We use sarcoplasm. Myoglobin is the red pigment that allows for, that has an affinity for oxygen, so it stores oxygen because we need oxygen in order to power the muscle contraction, especially if we're doing it using cellular respiration, which we talked about a while ago. We have these T tubules, which are basically just extensions of the sarcolemma that extend all around the muscle fiber. And when the impulse comes through, it's actually going to cause the release of the calcium ions to be through the strategic places throughout the muscle fiber. So the T tubule is kind of like um, uh, a roadway, if you will, for some of the molecules that need to be released in order for contraction to take place. And the calcium that is released from the structure called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it's a smooth endoplasmic reticulum, but it's of a muscle fiber, and its whole job is to store calcium. Myofibrils are bundles of myofilaments that contract. You have two different types of myofibrils in muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers. You have actin and you have myosin. And then a myofilament are the actin and the myosin filaments whose structure and functions account for the muscle striations and contractions in it. So myofibrils are bundles of myofilaments. The myofilaments are the actin and myosin, just to kind of clear that up a bit. So now we're just going to kind of look at this picture of get a little closer here. And look at this picture of all of the structures that we talked about. So we have our entire organ of the muscle, and it's this huge bundle of muscle parts. Let's just say that. So we're just going to say muscle parts. So we have this entire thing is composed of muscles. So if we come down and just pull one of those things out, so a muscle contains bundles of muscle fibers, and muscle fibers have many myofibrils. So if we pull out just this one muscle cell of this tissue here, and if we pull that one muscle cell out and we looked at it up close, this is what we'd find. So this whole thing is a muscle cell. Surrounding it is a sarcolemma, which is just the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. We also have our T tubules. The T tubules are the green things here. And notice how the green thing kind of wrap all around the muscle cell. Because remember, this whole thing is a muscle cell. This whole thing. Whole thing is a muscle cell. Then we have our nucleus there. Then we've got another nucleus there. So lots of nuclei. And then this blue stuff is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it's going to store calcium. So it's surrounding this muscle cell, and within this muscle cell are lots of these myofibrils. And these myofibrils are collections of actin and myosin filaments. So this one myofibril that we pulled out has the actin and the myosin filaments in there. So muscle fibers, more of that. The striations are the stripes that are formed by the placement of the actin and the myosin filaments within the myofibrils. And as we said before, there are two different types of myofilaments, myosin and actin. Another way you could think about them are thick filaments and thin filaments. The myosin are the thick filaments. They're going to have this globular protein head. The thin filaments are the actin. And although they're thin, they have a lot of different parts to them that can sort of account for the activity of the actin. So it's the interaction between the actin and the myosin that allows for that contraction to take place. An entire unit of actin and myosin is what we call a sarcomere. So if we take this myofibril and we further divide it down, we can see that we call those sarcomeres. When a sarcomere shortens, then that's what we call contraction. So myofibrils further divided into sarcomeres. Sarcomeres are going to be from one Z line to the next Z line. So let's see if we have a picture of this that will make it explain a little bit better. So I'm going to show you a picture of it in just a second, but before I move on and show the picture, I want to be sure that we kind of talk about what some of these structures are. So from one Z line to the next, that there is a sarcomere. That's just a unit of contraction on a muscle cell. Every muscle cell has multiple sarcomeres. So I'm going to go back to this picture to illustrate what I'm talking about. So let's go ahead and blow up. So notice that this is a Z line, and this is a Z line. that would be considered one sarcomere. So that is a contractile unit of muscle. But then from this Z line to probably back in here a little further, if they'd pulled it out to another Z line, is another sarcomere. So that is what we're talking about, is a contractile unit of muscle. Each of these sarcomeres from Z line to Z line have a middle portion to it. And the middle portion, let's go back out here, of that is going to be the center of it. And so the center of it is the H band. So Z lines on the end, H band in the middle. The I band are going to be where you only find thin filaments. The I band is directly connected to the Z line. So if we're going from the outside Z lines in, we have Z lines on the outside, then we have the I band, which are only those thin filaments, also known as actin, and then you have the A band, where you have the thick and the thin filaments, and then you have right there at the center the H band, where the thin filaments are connected right there to the center line. So the thin, did I skip? So thick filaments are composed of that protein myosin, and it's kind of shaped like a golf club. So it has this globular head, and then it has this straight portion that's bound together with other myosin tails. So it has a head and a tail. The head is real globby, and the tails, well, they look like tails. What helps the thin filament and the thick filament can interact with one another is that the head of the thick filament, the head of the myosin, will connect to the thin filament portion, a portion of that, and it will pull that thin filament in towards the center line. So can you imagine all of these myosin heads pulling in these thin filaments into the center, and that allows for contraction to take place. And that connection between the myosin head and the thin filament is what we call a cross bridge formation. Thin filaments have a bunch of stuff happening with them. They have, and the most important, or I shouldn't say most important, some of the most important, or what we care about right now, are the tropomyosin and the troponin. So tropomyosin and troponin interact with one another when the muscle is not contracting. When it is contracting, when there is calcium that's present, then troponin will be exposed. The active sites of the tropomyosin will be exposed, and it will connect with the myosin filament. So right now that probably seems like, whoa, 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 Kels, what are you talking about? So let's just break it down a bit. There are thick filaments and thin filaments. The interaction between the thin and the thick filaments is what causes the muscle to contract. When muscles contract, they contract on the level of the sarcomere, which is from Z line to Z line. When we look at that Z line, when we get real close to it on a microscope, we see that only the thin filaments are on the connected directly to the Z lines. If we move in a little bit closer, so let's see if we can draw this a little bit. So this would be a Z line. This would be another Z line. And then we have change colors. Thin filaments, make this thin filament a little longer. You too. Thin filaments, thin filaments, thin filaments, thin filaments, thin filaments, thin filaments. So we have our Z line here, thin filaments, that's our I band, and then we're going to now, let's go purple, make our myosin, aka thick filaments, myosin. And I want them to overlap because I want them to have an interaction with one another. So they have to have some sort of overlapping. So we have that overlap that happens, and we call that the I band. And then this is the middle part. I'm sorry, the overlapping is the A band. I'll put those labels there. So at the H band, that's where we only have thick filaments. So I just wanted them to connect right there. So we have our Z lines out here. And forgive my handwriting, it's difficult writing with the mouse. And then we have In our eye band, we have the thin, that says band. And then we have our myosin, and where they overlap, in this area overlap here, that was our A band. So when these thick filaments interact with the thin filaments, the thick filaments will pull the thin filaments in closer to the midline or the middle of the sarcomere. So imagine that these red lines getting pulled in by the purple lines on both sides. The sarcomere shortens, and that allows for muscle contraction to take place. So then you say, well, Kelly, how on earth does a thick filament and a thin filament interact with one another? Great question. So the way that a thick filament and a thin filament interact with one another is that a chemical is released, calcium, and it's going to bind to troponin on the thin filament and expose the active sites on tropomyosin of the thin filament. So the active sites or a portion of the thin filament will be exposed, and the thick filament is attracted to it and it pulls it in towards the center. That whole process is called the sliding filament model, where the muscle fiber contracts because the sarcomeres shorten. And the reason that the sarcomeres shorten is because the thick filaments are pulling the thin filaments in towards the center. So the thin filaments slide past the thick filaments, the I band shortens, the Z lines move closer together, and the H band, where there's only thick filament, pretty much disappears. So in order for a contraction to take place, we need some ATP to supply this energy, which is like, duh, muscle contractions totally need energy there. But what may not be so obvious is what the role is of ATP in muscle contractions. ATP's job is to break that cross bridge. So when the myosin filament gets ATP, it breaks it down, and their cross bridges pull. The cross bridges are going to recock the myosin head. So really that is the job of ATP, is that the ATP's job is to recock the myosin head to put it back into position. So imagine, if you will, you have your line up top and you had your purple line on the bottom. Part of that purple line comes up to that red line and then it pulls it in towards the center. And then the purple line, the myosin, the one that pulled the top one in towards the center, to put it back into position, we have an explosion of energy, or ATP. So here's a much nicer picture of what it is that I attempted to draw. So we have, this area is our H band. Notice there's only thin filament there. The A band, that's where we have our zones of overlap between the thin filament and the thick filament, or the actin and the myosin. And then Z lines are easy because they look like zigzags. So when the muscle is ready to contract, so this is a relaxing sarcomere, when it's ready to contract, these little globular heads of the myosin will connect to the actin and pulls it in towards the center. So notice how the sarcomere has shortened effectively as a result of the pulling in of the thin filaments towards the center. So we talked a little bit about how calcium does this job, and in chapter 12 we talked about the importance of calcium and it's being stored in skeletal muscle, and how vitamin D helps with the deposition of calcium in the skeletal, sorry, not in the skeletal muscle, but in the skeletal system, that we need calcium to be deposited into the skeletal system. Now, the job of calcium in the muscle contractions is that it's going to bind to a part of the actin. And when it binds to the part of the actin, it exposes that special part of the actin that the myosin head can connect to. Now, in order for calcium to be released, you have to consciously tell it to be released. Now, you don't say, all right, calcium, be released so I can get contraction to take place. You do it a little differently. You do it through a motor neuron. That motor neuron is a special type of nerve cell that stimulates the muscle to contract because it carries a chemical messenger called a neurotransmitter. The axon is the part of the neuron that actually stimulates the muscle fibers. And we'll talk more about axons and dendrites when we get into the nervous system. So this area where the nerve interacts with the muscle is called the neuromuscular junction. So where the axon terminal, the end of the nerve, comes near the sarcolemma, there's a little space that's there. So it doesn't actually touch it directly. It leaves what we call a synaptic cleft. It's a little space between them. What happens in that synaptic is that the nerve cell releases a chemical messenger that says, I need you to contract. And that messenger that says, I need you to contract is called acetylcholine, or ACH. So at that synaptic terminal, the nerve will release acetylcholine, and acetylcholine will bind to special gates or receptors on the muscle cell. And when it binds to those special nerves or special gates on the muscle cell, or what we call receptors on the muscle cells, it then can allow for another chemical reaction to take place. So just to clean this up a bit, when you want your muscles to contract, you think, I need to raise my arm. And it's so quick, you do it so often that it seems like it's instantaneous. But you do have the thought, I'm going to raise my arm. You do have that command that comes through there. So when that command comes through there, that nerve that goes to the muscle cell releases acetylcholine and releases the chemical. That acetylcholine will bind to the muscle cell, and that will allow for other gates to open up. And the other gates that open up are sodium channels. So here is a much nicer picture of that. You have the axon terminal, you have this space called the synaptic cleft, and these little green jobbies in the vesicles, those are the neurotransmitters. So if we get a little bit closer, we see that the neurotransmitters are released and they are binding to these receptors. And when they bind to those receptors, the gate opens up. And this gate that opens up allows for sodium ions to come in. When sodium ions come into the muscle, then that is signaling, it changes the activity that happens in the muscle, it excites it, and it allows for contraction, the things that need to happen for a contraction to take place. So acetylcholine diffuses across the cleft, binds to the receptors on the sarcolemma, which is just a fancy name for plasma membrane on the muscle cell. This generates an electrical signal that's spread throughout the sarcolemma. How that's done is because sodium ions come into the muscle cell, and it allows for it to contract. It allows for it to get excited, I should say. That's the electrical signal. And then calcium that's stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it can be released. So calcium is important, and I apologize for the way that this slide looks. Oh, this is a pretty important slide. When calcium is released, it binds to troponin. The troponin moves and exposes the active sites on tropomyosin. So that way the myosin can connect to it. The myosin molecule can connect to it. This gives me a headache. We're going to look at this picture. So when there is no calcium present, you have troponin that hangs on top of the binding sites of the tropomyosin strand. When calcium is released, the calcium binds to troponin, that special part. So this is a thin filament. This whole thing is a thin filament, and these are just all the parts of it, of the thin filament. You have your actin, you have your tropomyosin, and you have your troponin. So those are all parts. This whole thing is a thin filament. In order for the thick filament, which would be theoretically right there, and let's go ahead and just draw that. Let's just draw a thick filament. And remember, I'm not the greatest artist. So that would be one, and then we have another one. Let's go down here and do like that. And then we have SNAR. And we just imagine all of these thick filaments. Remember, they're shaped kind of like a golf club. So when calcium is released, it binds to troponin, and now we can get to these active sites. So now this myosin can attach to that little black dot there, but it can't do that until calcium pulls the tropomyosin strand away. So it kind of pulls it away and exposes the active sites. So the myosin heads also have ATP active sites. Myosin heads attached to the actin, and ADP and inorganic phosphate are released, and the myosin heads go back to their normal place. So we have that calcium is released, it exposed the binding sites on the thin filament. We have the power stroke that takes place there, and then ATP recocks that myosin head. So when ATP breaks down, the myosin head detaches from actin and it pushes it back into place. So it kind of recocks that myosin head. So we need ATP in order to keep this detachment from happening, keep this detachment happening. So we can always get our muscle fibers to, go back to resting, so they can be ready for the next contraction. Rigor mortis happens when the muscle is no longer able to contract after the body is dies or passes on. So after a person passes on, there's no more ATP that's available. And so there's no more ATP to recock that myosin head or to detach the myosin from the actin to get it to go back to where it needs to be. So that's where that stiffness of rigor mortis comes in. Now, it's not permanent, and they can use how much stiffness is there to kind of estimate the time of death for an individual. So it's not permanent because eventually the calcium ions will start to diffuse away from the actin molecule. So a motor unit is just a nerve fiber and all the muscle fibers it innervates. So what we looked at was just one nerve coming to one muscle cell and kind of talking about how the acetylcholine is released. So when acetylcholine is released, then it causes sodium ions to come in, causes an action potential. Remember that term. We'll talk about it again in chapter 14. Creates an action potential. That action potential is then going to allow for the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. Calcium ions are going to bind to troponin, which causes the tropomyosin to roll over and expose the active sites on the globular proteins or the active sites on the actin. The myosin attaches to the active sites and pulls those thin filaments in towards the center. ATP recocks that myosin head, and we start this whole process over again. So we only looked at one neuron doing that to one muscle cell. But in actuality, there are multiple muscle cells that are affected by just one nerve. So that's what we call a motor unit. So for every contraction, there are 3 phases of it. We have that latent period, which is just the buildup of all the stuff we need for the contraction to take place, acetylcholine being released, sodium coming in, calcium being released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then we have that contraction period where the myosin head is actually attaching to the thin filament and pulling it in towards the center. And then we have all the stuff that happens in relaxation. Acetylcholine goes back into the synaptic terminal of the nerve cell. We have the calcium going back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the myosin heads being recocked. So those are those 3 phases of a muscle contraction. We also have 3 phases of a muscle twitch. And what happens here is that notice that we have force and we have time. Over time, the amount of force generated or contraction within a muscle can increase over time to a point. So at first, when we have the stimulus come through, let's say that you're lifting a weight. You're lifting a weight, that is the stimulus there. So we have a contraction, relaxation happening. And then if we have another repeated stimulus, we have contraction, but notice how we can generate more force. We have more power with that second contraction and then relaxation. And if we have another contraction there, we have even more force that's generated. But this time, if we have a contraction or a stimuli come again, then we don't really get as much time to rest. And we call that summation. So the less time you have to rest on there, notice how we don't get those big giant jumps in how much force that we have available. And at some point, your muscle fibers or your muscle cells can start to exhibit continuous contraction or what we call tetanus. And it can only sustain that for so long. If those repeated stimuli keep coming and keep coming, it can only sustain this contraction for so long until eventually it fatigues. And then it's just like, I'm done. I'm resting. So when you're lifting weights or doing push-ups or pull-ups, you have what happens, a process called recruitment. That means the intensity of the neuron stimulation. As the intensity of the nervous system is stimulated because you're doing this exercise, more motor units are going to be activated. So if you pick up a pin, you only need a couple of motor units to pick that pin up, right? Very light. But if you pick up a table, you're going to have to recruit more motor units in order to contract more muscles to get this work to happen. Muscle tone is defined as muscle firmness. So that's the amount of muscle tone you have is dependent upon muscle contractions. So some motor units are always contracted, but not enough to actually cause movement, and that's what we consider tone. When you work out, when you run, lift weights, swim, or whatever your activity is, the more tone, muscle tone you have, so I mean those beautiful six-pack abs and those nice shapely arms and legs and all that stuff, good stuff, the more toned you are, the more calories your body actually burns. So muscle tone doesn't just look good, muscle tone is also good for your body, and it also helps your body to stay nice and healthy. So you're probably wondering, where do your muscles get all this energy from in order to do the things that it needs to do? So there are a couple of different energy sources. You can have energy stored in the muscle itself, and that's using the form of glycogen and triglycerides. You can have energy sources stored in the blood, and that's usually glucose and fatty acids. Um, which of these that the muscles actually use depends on exercise intensity and how long you're going to be exercising. So as the amount of time you exercise increases, your use of the muscle energy storage decreases and the use of energy sources from the blood increases. So it will take all of the glycogen and the triglycerides that we have stored in the muscle cells and use those first. But then after those are depleted, it's going to have to go to the energy sources that are found circulated in your blood. Now, there are three pathways by which muscle cells can use those energy sources in order to create ATP, which is needed for the contraction. The first way is the first two ways are anaerobic, which means that we don't have to use any oxygen to make this thing go down. And that's one is the creatine phosphate pathway. So creatine phosphate is a chemical that's in your muscles, in your body, and what it will do is that will actually donate its phosphate group to ADP in order to make energy, or ATP. And then there's a whole enzymatic reaction that happens with that. For another anaerobic activity is that instead of using creatine, it will use glycogen, and it will go through this process of fermentation in order to give you ADP, or to have this phosphorylation take place, turning ADP into ATP. And we're left over with this byproduct of lactate. Lactate you're probably familiar with because the lactate that's present sends signals to your brain that lets you know about fatigue, when your body is starting to fatigue and get worn down, and when the muscles are starting to get tired. Now, the aerobic way is probably the most efficient way because you get the most energy out of it is by using oxygen. That oxygen goes in here to the mitochondria, and through cellular respiration, you're able to make energy, or ATP. And the byproducts you get are not this lactate, which could, signal fatigue, but it's carbon dioxide and also water. So there are two different types of muscle fibers in your body, and they differ slightly in structure. You have fast twitch fibers and you have slow twitch fibers. Fast twitch fibers are mostly anaerobic, and they have an explosion of power. So when we talked about fermentation and the creatine phosphate pathway over in the previous slide, those would be the two pathways that are primarily used for your fast twitch fibers. Those fibers tend to be very, very big, very bulky, and they are meant for power. Slow twitch fibers, on the other hand, are really built for endurance. They get most of their energy with oxygen through the aerobic pathway. And it's a nice steady power, but it also has more endurance. So if you think about the weightlifter, think fast twitch fibers. And if you think about the long distance runner, then you think more of those slow twitch fibers. So wrapping all of this up here, going back to the skeletal system, both the muscular systems and the skeletal systems work together in order to produce movement for the body. Skeletal muscles contract or pull on those bones, causing movement of the joints, and that allows us to respond to changes in the environment. Changes in the environment could be pulling your hand away from a hot stove or running from a bear. Contraction of skeletal muscles allow for chewing and swallowing, which are important for digestion. So for any of these systems that we're going to be talking about, we talked about skeletal muscles or skeletal system first, we talked about the muscular system first. They all bind with one another and they help the body to maintain homeostasis. So not one organ system is just doing its thing on its own. They all are constantly working together in order to keep the body in homeostasis and have the body do all the things that it needs to do. The muscle system and the skeletal systems both help to protect your body: brain, heart, lungs, spinal cord, kidneys. Muscles Skeletal muscle pads and protects the bones. And as we said before, the muscles of the abdominal region help to protect the internal abdominal organs. Muscles also help to maintain body temperature, which we talked about before, and how that ATP, when it's broken down by that myosin head, allows for a tremendous amount of heat to be released there. In addition, when you're cold, your smooth muscle constricts, so it pulls the blood vessels closer to the inside of the body to conserve heat. When you're cold, you involuntarily shiver, that your muscles having these little mini contractions so that we can have more ATP broken down to generate heat. So these are just a couple of kind of coming together sorts of things that talk about how the muscular system helps other organ systems in the body. And even goosebumps that form in cold temperatures are the erector pili muscles, which are smooth muscles in your skin or underneath your skin that cause the hair to stand up. For humans, and they also cause the hair to stand up when you are angry. So when the hair is scared, the hair on your arm stands up and you can kind of see those goosebumps that you get. If you were a furrier animal, it would make you look really big and you'd be really, really look bigger because you'll be furrier. Think about a cat that gets really mad and how they look furrier. And also if you were furrier, it would help to keep you warm. So that really isn't quite as effective in humans, but we still have that. All right, so that is all of skeletal muscle. Next time we talk, we will be talking about the nervous system, one of my favorite organ systems in the body. It's really awesome. All right, so this was awesome. I will talk to you guys soon. Have a great morning, afternoon, or night.